Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of.
I'm Jane Garrity, and welcome to my podcast. A Gift of Time is my memoir. I discuss childhood trauma, PTSD, alcohol abuse, and my spiritual awakening and healing journey. Thank you for listening. Please hit subscribe and follow. If my story is resonating with you, it will resonate with someone that you know. Please share it. Trigger warning. This episode discusses domestic abuse and symptoms of PTSD. Episode 5, 2011. With each step up, I watched my footing on the mossy rocks and stumps. I looked up from my feet to take in my surroundings. I was hiking up along the Crawford Path Trail from Route 302 on the way to the summit of Mount Pierce in the Presidential Mountain Range of New Hampshire. I saw green moss crawling up tree trunks and wispy, nebulous webs of it hanging off broken branches. Hobbits. I thought of how Bilbo Baggins' home was covered in earth. It was so quiet. I could just hear my breathing and footfalls. It was misty and moody in late October in the White Mountains, and in that moment, I fell in love with hiking. My mind was full of processing recent circumstances. My husband and I had finally decided to split after 18 years of marriage a couple of months prior. My goal was to wait until my youngest had graduated high school in 3 years, but after one eventful family day outing, I had to decide once and for all. We had both taken Labor Day off and decided to bring the kids for a fun day in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We visited and climbed in the USS Albacore submarine, drove out to Newcastle and checked out the forts, and ended it with lunch and walking around Main Street, checking out the shops. I don't know what made him so mad that day, but it seemed that everything I said was wrong. I said something to him while he was driving, and he snapped. "Sorry," I turned around and mouthed to the kids in the back seat. We went to eat lunch at a restaurant, and he was really going at it with my 14-year-old. It was like he just couldn't do anything right that day. He would just grab his shirt collar in the middle of the sidewalk and get up close into his face and softly yell that he wasn't having any more of whatever nonsense he was doing. It made me flinch. We were all walking on eggshells and minding our tongues, and I said to him, quietly, "What's going on? Will you please stop? We're trying to have a nice day." He told me to shut up and mind my own business. We ended up in a shop that afternoon, and it had started raining. So while he went to grab the car, the kids and I were finally alone, and I said to them, "I'm so sorry. I was really hoping we could have a nice family day, and I'm sorry. It's been horrible. I'm sorry." My oldest quickly chimed in, and she said, "Mom, it's not your fault. Dad is being such a dick." She was 16. Shortly after we got home that day, he brought his laundry basket to the living room and was screaming at me that it was my fault that all of his clothes were wrinkled. We had all been handling our own laundry for a couple of years now, and I needed to put my laundry in the dryer, and my husband's clothes were in there. So I pulled them out, put them in an empty laundry basket, and put my load in. I didn't think it was a big deal. It was something we did all the time. But on that day, he lost it. As he was screaming at me, he put his middle finger against my nose. "Fuck you! You did this on purpose. All my clothes are wrinkled because of you." That's when my 14-year-old decided to step in between us. It was him who was slammed against the wall this time. I was yelling for him to stop, and he just kept screaming at us. Back in 2007, when we had gone to marriage counseling a few times, I was too scared to speak my mind and say that he was abusive. I didn't trust that I wouldn't have repercussions from it, so I kept it quiet. But because I didn't speak up and chose instead to keep the peace, we flew through those therapy sessions with flying colors. I went to a couple more therapists by myself at that time, but none of them helped. I was met with, "Maybe you're bipolar. It's just depression. Stay on the Prozac." I also had no idea how to communicate. I had stopped sharing my feelings with my husband years before because when I did, it was met with defensive outbursts where things flew at my head and it was just easier to avoid it altogether. I decided that maybe I should go on my own to therapy instead. But I would end up quitting because it seemed as if they, I tried 3, just wanted to diagnose me with something and prescribe meds versus actually helping me and showing me that I was in a safe place to share. After we had gone to marriage counseling, he seemed better. It felt like he really wanted to try, and I did too. We had already been married for 14 years and had 2 kids. We were invested to make it work. We both made the commitment to really try after that. I stopped drinking. I started working out. We didn't have huge fights anymore, and the communication was starting to get better. He would do all the things that I liked to do with me, and I would do all the things he liked to do with him. But after 3 years of trying, we realized that we were so far apart that when we did try to come together, it didn't work. Neither one of us had shared interests anymore, and it always felt like we were forcing the relationship. In 2011, leading up to my 40th birthday, I was craving adventure and exploration. Every time I wanted to do something different and try new things like hiking or traveling, my husband wasn't interested. And if I made plans to do these things with friends, he would get insecure, tell me I couldn't go. He'd get mad at me. I got to the point where I did whatever I wanted anyway and accepted whatever type of punishment that he gave me, which was usually the silent treatment. So as I was planning my 40th birthday, I had always wanted to visit the islands. So I told him I wanted to go to Jamaica. He, of course, said no. He said he didn't want to spend the money. And I said, too bad. I'm not asking. I found a deal, and if you don't want to go with me, I'm going to bring someone else. We don't turn 40 every day. He quickly changed his mind because he didn't want me to go with anyone else but him. So I booked a trip to Jamaica for my 40th birthday. And the trip was good. It was as if we were young kids again, not a care in the world, enjoying the pool, beach, all of it. It was like he was his old self again, the young 24-year-old that I had married. I called him Vacation Husband and asked if Vacation Husband could come out a little more often, as he seemed to be letting loose and having fun. And I liked that guy, way better than the one he was while at home. Well, we were out with friends a couple months later, and I asked if Vacation Husband could come out to play. He said no, that he would never be like Vacation Husband again. He didn't like that version of himself. It was right after that trip when I got a job offer at a supplement supply company for a product management role, and I took it. It was time for me to leave the spa industry behind and get back to corporate so that I could make more money. The truth was, I secretly wanted to go back to working full-time in corporate so that if worse came to worse, I'd be able to support myself and the kids. After coming home from a work trip that was shortly after that failed family day in Portsmouth, he noticed I wasn't wearing my wedding ring. We talked at length about a divorce and how to tell the kids. We had finally come to the mutual conclusion that it was time to split. We didn't want to uproot the kids, and we still didn't really have a plan yet, so we decided that we would be the ones to share the house with the kids, and we would take turns every other week living there. We didn't think it would be fair for them to move around, and it would also give us time to figure out how we wanted to manage everything and get the paperwork started through the court system. By this time, my mother had moved back to New Hampshire in 2002, and she said it would be okay if I stayed there every other week. This meant every other week I would pack up my things and stay at my mother's and then back and forth for 3 months. One of my sisters was also living with my mother at the time, so I had to use a pull-out couch in the finished basement, and it quickly became my space every other week. This is when I started dabbling with alcohol again. One evening, my mother found me passed out on the floor in my underwear, and she covered me with a blanket. I told her I was fine, that I'd be fine, just leave me alone. So on that chilly October day, as I hiked up Mount Pierce, I thought of things like, why did I wait so long to divorce him? Why was I so scared to leave? Why did I think that my parents wouldn't have helped me if I came to them sooner? Would they have even helped me? Why did I marry him in the first place? How could I have done this to my kids? It was as if my soul needed to be in that lush, mossy forest, in the still and quiet, as I huffed and puffed, breathing fresh mountain air and just having the time to hang out in my own head to work things out. It felt meditative. During that hike, when I came to the realization that all four of us had our own experience. My experience was mine. My ex-husband's experience was his. My daughter's experience was hers. And my son's his. This helped me to understand that we were all hurt in various ways, and each one of our experiences was true, valid, real, and unique. And they were all traumatic and full of emotional wounds. After the holidays, my soon-to-be ex-husband and I decided that we were both exhausted from the last 3 months of moving in and out of the house weekly. We decided to stop it since now we were just waiting for the courts to finalize everything so he would move out while I stayed in the house with the kids. He would pay child support, and every other weekend I would have to force the kids to go spend time with their dad. One day, I got a call from the school nurse. She said that I needed to come and pick up my 14-year-old because he was sick. When I arrived, she met me in the hallway and told me that he and some other kids were trying to get high from K2. K what? It was a synthetic drug supposed to mimic cannabis, but instead made them extremely ill. I brought him home and called the doctor and was told just to monitor him, he would end up okay. That afternoon when he woke up, he laughed and said, "What a trip!" I wanted to throttle him and hug him at the same time. I'm pretty sure I yelled at him because how could he do this? I had to miss work because of it. The separation and divorce would prove to be a challenging one for us all. My kids re-entered public school that fall while their parents were moving in and out of the house each week. By this time, my youngest wasn't attending classes, and I had no idea what he did all day. I would come home from work to see him and other boys I didn't know hanging around my house, and I felt suspicious of them. Had they been here all day skipping school? Using my house as a home base? Why is there an empty vodka bottle on the grass? I was beginning to not feel secure in my own home anymore. I didn't trust him or his friends. I would make sure I hid jewelry and that there was no cash laying around. I told him that he needed to go to school, get his work done, and turn it around, and that if he didn't, I would have to make him live with his dad. He didn't want to live with his dad, but he also couldn't get his shit together, and I felt that I was at a loss. I would catch him sneaking back into the house at 5 a.m. after him being out all night. The school kept calling to ask where he was and how we would fix the situation with him. The principal would have me and him in the office and tell us the protocol and how he could get back on track. Nothing worked. I spoke with my ex-husband and said, "You have to take him. If you don't bring the hammer down, we'll lose him. He's only 15. We made the decision that he would move back into the house full time, and I would move out in an effort to get our son back on track. It was agonizing for me. My family had their opinions. How could a mother leave her own children? I'm doing the best I can right now. But they're your kids, Jane. The shame and guilt I felt as a mother and as a human being was met with more shame and guilt-filled opinions from my family. I again felt I had nowhere to turn. I was still doing everything wrong and disappointing my parents, even though I was a 40-year-old adult. They never came to me with solutions, only shame. I knew in my heart that I was making the right decision, even if no one else thought I was. No one was throwing out any other suggestions, just judging me. My oldest during this time was doing well, being back in school, and participated with FIRST Robotics, and had a girlfriend, and stayed mostly away from the house and hung out with friends. I would later learn that it was her way of coping with everything. Avoidance was the easiest path at the time, for all of us. One day, before we made the switch, I went into the grocery store, and he insisted he wait in the car. I knew in my gut he was going to run. I found him at Five Guys where my mother-in-law happened to be meeting us, and we all sat outside. We were all crying, and he told me he was so angry with me because he didn't want to live with his dad. How could I do this to him? That with me, he could do whatever he wanted, and with his dad, he would have to follow the rules. I felt destroyed about it. How else could I save him? I felt there was no other way, no other options at the time. I, like my parents before me, had abandoned him at the worst time. I went to visit my mother and asked her if I could live with her for a bit until I was able to get a place of my own, now that my ex and I were trading places. As part of the agreement for swapping roles with my ex, he asked for us to change places with child support too, and it seemed fair to me. So now I'd be responsible for paying the child support, and I couldn't find anything affordable on my own with the little leftover budget that I had. But my mom said no. I understood. I didn't blame her. My sister had just moved out, and she was finally able to have her own space back. I wouldn't have wanted me to move in either. During that time, I was moving in and out of my house weekly. I met a man at work. The first day we met was in a meeting room with a couple of other people, and the energy was electric, magnetic. You could feel it. He ended up leaving the company, and we started corresponding over LinkedIn, and then we started meeting up after work. I had felt that it was like I met him someplace before. We would talk about our past, and we realized that we would have almost met each other multiple times prior, and it felt like the universe had put us together on purpose. And at the exact moment in time, and I would say, the cosmos are aligning. He was the one who brought me up Crawford Path that day for a hike, my first 4,000 footer. We would chat and also have solitude. We didn't need to talk to each other while we hiked. It was good. On that Thanksgiving, the first one without my kids, I had gotten home from my aunt's house, crawled into bed with my clothes on, and cried. He called and said, "Let's go out and grab a drink." I said no, and he said, "Come on, it'll be good for you to get out of that bed." After my divorce, we developed a relationship. I now know that it was karma and soul agreements, and he would prove to be a soul to help me along in my journey at that most pivotal time in my life. He said I could move in with him and split the rent, and it would help him out financially too. So that's what I did. I knew it probably wasn't a good idea, and I knew how it would look to others, my shaming family. But I really needed a place to live and someone to share a rent payment with. At 41 years old, it wasn't like I was able to find roommates, and back then, Craigslist was a shady place. I had little money and was short on time, so I agreed. And I loved him. When I had moved out from my family's home, I took my clothes, one bureau, and one bookshelf. According to the decree, I was supposed to get the TV, dining room set, some other furniture, but I left it all behind. It seemed unnecessary for me to take anything, and I left it for the kids, really. So I moved into my new boyfriend's apartment, and we spent most weekends hiking and exploring small towns in New England. We were both broke, and hiking was our therapy. He called it his church, and I related to that. It would be one hike that summer, Mount Sunapee, that as I was hiking down, when I had the thought, the sudden epiphany, that we had all lived in an abusive household. I abused my kids. I was abused by my husband. My husband abused our kids. And I never took them out of the abusive house. I failed as a mom so many times over the years. It was all my fault, and now here I was, exiling myself while the three of them carried on, and I carried the blame. After we lived together for a few months, I began having emotional outbursts. If something happened, I would lose it, find blame and fault that wasn't my own. I would flinch if I was startled by something falling on the floor and loud bangs and noises. One time, he was joking around, and he put his hands to my throat, and I panicked. He saw my eyes as I grabbed his hands and the look of terror on my face. He felt terrible and apologized profusely. Neither one of us expected that turn from laughing and joking to one of terror. We would go out on a Friday after work, and by the end of the night, after however many drinks, I would have outbursts and fits of rage. I would yell and scream at him. I don't even remember why. I had no idea at the time it was called a trigger. I thought I was just losing my mind. It must have been from the booze. I began smoking cigarettes again, and he hated the smell of it, and it was a difficult smell to hide. But in the end, I wanted something that he couldn't give me. I was looking for external validation and comfort, and he wasn't codependent like me. He didn't understand why I would get so anxious, and neither did I. I felt as though I had become the villain in my own story. One evening after work, I went on a trail run and was startled by a huge buck. The same week, while driving with a friend to a trailhead on a Saturday morning, we saw a bear. Then, a few days later, as I was driving home from work on 3A in Bow, I saw a moose. I took them all as a sign from the universe that for me to witness these large animals in quick succession, I needed to pay attention to what they were telling me. It was time for me to leave that relationship. I wasn't myself. I was still paying child support and barely making ends meet and knew I couldn't pay for my own apartment. And not knowing where else to turn, I went back to my mom's. This time, when I asked my mother if I could move into her empty bedroom until I could find my own place, she said yes. So, at 42 years old, I moved back in with my mother. We agreed on a small amount of monthly rent, some roommate-style rules, and I settled in. I would spend most nights sitting on her patio drinking Bacardi and Diet and chain-smoking cigarettes. It was when the nightmares began. I learned how to wake myself up in the middle of one by screaming. Sometimes these dreams were paralyzing. It was a recurring dream with the same pattern, trying to get away, falling, paralyzed, scream, wake up. At first I would open my mouth and there would be nothing. No sound. Wait, I know I'm dreaming. Try again. Try again, Jane. Blah. The screams were barely audible. And then, wake yourself up, Jane. It's a dream. Ah! And I would scream myself awake. Each night I would drink until I passed out because I was afraid to fall asleep and have the dream. My mother was worried at times and she would say to me, Jane, you go through so much Bacardi. Are you okay? Yeah, Mom, I'm fine. I had new freedom though, and I had my weekends down to a T. I would get up at 5 a.m. on a Saturday, drive to the mountains while chain smoking, summit by 9 a.m., and then bellied up to the bar at the Woodstock Inn a couple minutes before noon. Hiking became my sanctuary, and each time I stepped foot on a trail, I felt grateful for that relationship that I had to end with my boyfriend. Grateful for him teaching me and showing me hiking lessons which gave me the confidence to do it on my own. One evening, as I was coming home from work and heading up the stairs to my room, my mother was there waiting for me, and she said, It must have been so hard for you to leave your kids and make that decision you made. I'm sorry you had to do that. And I cried, and she cried. We hugged. I said, Mom, it was the most agonizing decision I ever had to make. I didn't know what else to do. I was so appreciative of her acknowledging how awful it was and the whole situation we had been in. It felt validating. I had known that the other family members that questioned me and shamed me would eventually see that I did make the right decision, but it would take years until that finally happened. By this time, when I was living in my mother's home, the kids were 16 and 18, and once the oldest turned 18, the child support amount was reduced. Living with my mother in my early 40s while unknowingly in the throes of PTSD was a huge challenge. There was one time when she had gone to the store where my youngest was working, and she said he had a runny nose and that he must be snorting coke. What? I didn't believe that at all. He was 15 at the time, and there was no way he was doing coke while working in the produce department. She was insistent, to the point where she was yelling and pointing her finger in my face and physically backed me into a corner, and I felt trapped. It seemed like she lost her mind a bit while my adrenaline pulsed through my body, and all I wanted to do was flee. I was shaking. One time she had taken clean spoons out of the dishwasher, and they still had a coffee stain in them. I was the only one who drank coffee, and I was sitting at the table with her friend, and she promptly interrupted us to show me the spoons, and I had to get up right then and there and hand wash the stains. I felt like she had to embarrass me on purpose while her friend was there, and it worked. My mind automatically went to, no wire hangers, from the iconic Mommy Dearest. We had more good times while I lived there than bad. On Saturday nights, we would sit at the kitchen table and play cribbage. We would take turns making each other dinner, and she subscribed to HBO just because she knew I loved watching their series. But I was so unhappy, depressed, chain smoking, alcohol abuser. I was only able to try and ease my pain versus being able to connect with my mother. In the fall of 2014, now having less of a child support payment, I'd found a cute apartment on the west side. I wasn't making much more income at the time, but with the lower child support payments, I knew it was a time for me to leave my mother's. My mother was upset and didn't want me to leave. Does she want me here, or does she just want the rent? I was so confused because I had learned her way of sharing her feelings always came out as anger. I wasn't in a mental place to understand that my mother was only projecting her own abandonment wounds and that it wasn't anything to do with me. I was 43 years old, and for the very first time in my life, I had my own apartment. It felt liberating, scary, and a sense of freedom I never knew or had before. There were weeks, though, where I had no money. Entering a pay week on a Monday with $2 in my bank account, and I would say to myself, okay, Jane, I have gas in my tank, a roof over my head, and food in the fridge. I got this. I can make it to payday. One time, I had a $20 bill in my purse, and I stopped at the mobile station and bought a bottle of wine and cigarettes for $10. Some woman came up to me asking for gas money, and I thought, okay, universe, I hear you. And I gave her my last $10. She needed it more than I did because I had gas in my tank. I was still having nightmares and would still wake myself up screaming. The recurring dream was now happening in my new apartment. I had put a small chime on the door so that it would wake me up if anyone tried to get in. I also became a bit reclusive. I would stay at home every night and decline invitations from friends, open a $10 box of wine, and binge watch Orange is the New Black, as I could only afford Netflix at the time. I had a good job back in the tech industry, and things were good. I had no complaints, just gratitude for what I did have. And I was tired. I felt tired all the time. I only had a few months left of child support payments, so I felt like I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was prepared, so that I changed my direct deposit to stop on that very week of my son's 18th birthday. My ex-husband was pissed. How could I cut him off unexpectedly like that? No warning. Now what was he going to do without the additional $800 per month? I didn't care. Fuck him. I just let his anger roll off my back this time. Couldn't hurt me anymore. Years after my divorce, my father let me know that I had, in fact, made the right decision when my youngest was off the rails to be with his father and not me. I told you so, I thought. But did I? I left my kids with their abuser. I had already accepted the fact that I would always make decisions that disappointed my parents in some way or another, no matter how old I was. They would always make me feel shameful, and I chose to not carry it anymore. I'm going to keep making decisions that my heart takes the lead on, because the heart never lies. I've gone up to hike that same path up to the summit of Mount Pierce several times over the years, and I always stop at that same place on the trail, with the crawling, moss, and quiet. But that first time, in the misty, moody October day, will always be my favorite. That time when I learned about climbing mountains, processing things in my own head, solitude, and meditation. This concludes episode 5. Thank you for listening. I appreciate all of your love, support, and kind words so far. Thank you all for sharing your own journeys with me. It will get better. We can heal through it. I promise. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe and follow along.
Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of